Hello.
Hi.
So this is sort of a last minute thing. I found out this morning that I was asked to say a few words, and I'm kind of uncomfortable about that. Not because I feel like I'm not a good public speaker, I am, but I'm Native American, I'm Canadian Indian. My first reaction was I didn't feel like that I should be a speaker at a Black Lives Matter gathering. And I wanted to acknowledge that straight away. Now, that said, I've been thinking about this for many years. And in this country, in my country, the atrocity that has been visited upon black people, as you've heard from some of the other speakers today, is a twin atrocity to the atrocity that's been visited on my Native brothers and sisters. It started at the same time, and it has continued for the sum of this country in varying degrees. So what I was asked to talk about, and this is why I agreed, is to talk about what it was like growing up in Los Alamos as a person of color, and to talk a little bit about implicit bias and some of the thoughts that I guess I posted on Facebook about that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. But first, I wanted to take a moment and just say thank you, Chief. I've known the Chief since shortly after he was hired. I've worked with the police department when I was an employee at Los Alamos County. I can confirm that he is working very hard on these issues. And I was part of the project. Well, I was adjacent to the project to get the body cams on. I know that the Chief has been very serious about that. And so that's part of my experience growing up in and living in Los Alamos County as a person of color. My experiences have been mixed in that arena. So I was the first class that went to Los Alamos Middle School. In 7th grade, I went to one of the two junior high schools. There was Pueblo, and then there was Cumbres. I think it was Cumbres, I don't remember for sure anymore now. And then the next year, it became Los Alamos Middle School, and we all went up to the Mesa. And my experiences in 7th and 8th grade are pretty terrible. It was the first time in my life that I have clear memories of being marked and called racial slurs. And I know that that's probably going to surprise some people here in Los Alamos, but I was called a drunken Injun. I was called target practice. I was called, I don't remember. Okay, so first people thought I was Hispanic, so they called me a greaser, a wetback, a beaner. And then when I corrected them and pointed out that I was Native American, kind of thinking that maybe I'd have an upper hand and point them out as an ignorant fool, then they just changed the tack and started calling me different racial slurs as a Native American. And that wasn't the sum of it. I mean, everyone's been called names. Not everyone's been called names every day of their life for 2 years. That happened to me. But the other thing that happened was that I was on a periodic basis, I was held down while someone smeared cheese in my hair or poured a soda on my crotch so that it would look like I urinated in my pants. And I was shoved into lockers and different things like that. And all of those were accompanied by various racial slurs. That happened here in Los Alamos in the 80s. So I don't want you to think that there is no history of racism and overt bigotry in Los Alamos, because there is. That has happened. I've lived it. It's a fact. Now, that being the case, I haven't had personal experiences with the police department in Los Alamos where I felt like my life was threatened. That hasn't happened to me. That's anecdotal. I'm not saying it hasn't happened to other people. It hasn't happened to me. But I've also lived in New York City. I've lived in San Francisco. I've been in various states around the country, and I have had the experience on many occasions of being pulled over and doing everything you're supposed to do, keeping my hands on the steering wheel, saying yes sir, yes ma'am, no sir, no ma'am, and then feeling very much like all I had to do was sneeze and I could be on the wrong end of a gun or something like that, where I was being questioned as if I were obviously up to something because my tail light was out, where I left that interaction shaking and scared and cried. That's happened to me. And I didn't get a ticket, because I was actually doing nothing wrong. That's happened to me. And I want you to know that because of that experience, I do drills with my son, my 14-year-old Native American son, and I'm not so worried about his experiences up here, but I am worried about his experiences everywhere else in this country. I do drills with him where I say, okay, you've been pulled over. And then I yell at him and I accuse him of things, and his job is to practice saying, yes, sir, no, sir, and to be very respectful and compliant the whole time. And that is no reflection on our police department. I want to be clear for me. That is a reflection on my experiences in this country as a person of color as recently as 2002, shortly before I moved back up here. But actually even getting pulled over once for a taillight out in Santa Fe, I had that experience. So I just want you to be aware of what it's like, what it's actually like. It is terrifying when you're a person of color to get pulled over because you don't know how that's going to go. You don't know how that's going to go, even if you're a computer programmer with a Q clearance for Los Alamos National Laboratory. You just don't know how that's going to go. And I want you all to really understand that. And the reason I was asked here was because of some of my posts about implicit bias. And I just want to talk about the idea of implicit bias because it's sort of a word that maybe some of you don't think means much. And what it means is the bias that we bring to any interaction we have with any other human being. In this case specifically, it's the bias that we bring to someone whose skin color is darker, black, brown, any number of gradients on that scale. And I want to start with the idea because I think a lot of the problems in this country boil down to the idea that being biased against someone for their race makes you a bad person. It does not make you a bad person. Every single person in this country has implicit bias based on race. We need to start from there, from understanding that I have implicit bias based on race. Tina has implicit bias based on race. My sister has implicit bias based on race. Terry has implicit bias based on race. Jordan has implicit bias based on race. Isaac has implicit bias based on race. Everyone has implicit bias based on race. It does not make you a bad person. It's just a fact. If we can start from there, then we can make some progress. Because if you can just accept that you're not a bad person because you have implicit bias based on race, then you're able to take the next step to start examining what are your implicit biases. What are you afraid of when you see a black person or a brown person? Why, when I walk into certain businesses in Los Alamos where I've lived for nearly 50 years, why do I still, even when I'm wearing a suit, why do I get followed around like I'm going to steal something? I mean, seriously. Why? Why, when I go to a restaurant in Santa Fe to get a table for 5 people and I'm standing there patiently waiting in line to say that I've got a party of 5, why does the hostess, who's a person of color, look at me and then turn her attention to the white lady standing behind me and say, how many? And put me in a position where I feel like I have to be rude and say, oh, 5. It's just implicit bias. It's not that they're bad people. Where I judge someone is when they refuse to acknowledge their implicit bias, when they refuse to engage with that self-reflection. That's where we should be judging people. And I just wanted to put that context out there because it's really important. And what are some of the things that we could be doing as a community, as a country, to deal with implicit bias? Unfortunately, I haven't had time to do the research into finding out if there are effective evidence-based programs related to implicit bias training. But here's what we can do. We can demand that at least for organizations that we have like a lot of control over, like the county or different public organizations, we can demand that everyone in HR gets a lot of implicit bias training. Because if we look back through history, if we want to look at how racism acts in the U.S. today, mostly we don't have too many interactions with overt bigotry. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It does happen. Mostly that's not the case, though. Mostly what happens is that Elizabeth or Ron are more likely to get a job interview than Jamal or Lakeisha. A guy named Jose spent 6 months looking for a job interview as a computer programmer, and as soon as he changed his resume so that it said Joe instead of Jose, he had 5 calls the next day. True story. That's implicit bias. And I guarantee you that the HR manager or whoever was involved in filtering out the Jose resume versus the Joe resume would be horrified to see that, because they don't want to be overt bigots. Nobody wants to be an overt bigot. And it causes us to refuse to examine ourselves and to see where we are being bigoted, because we've judged ourselves, and the only response we have is to say, oh, no, that's not me. Well, maybe it is. Maybe it is. So what I want to see is I want to see HR departments have required annual implicit bias training about gender, about race, about language. I want to see police departments have required annual implicit bias training about those same things. I want to see managers have required annual implicit bias training. I want to see public officials, before they can get sworn in, have required implicit bias training. I want to see our senators, our congressmen, president, everyone. Anyone who has influence over the lives of a lot of people should be required to have implicit bias training in order for us to be a better country. That's what I want to see. And I want to thank everyone. I think that this has been a good event. And that's it.